Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3. Stand up 8. Recording number 2. Episode 1. Surviving something awful is one thing. Telling the story, really telling it out loud, is another. For me, this story about surviving has been a long time coming. 30 years. And I'll be honest, there are many days when I wonder if it's even worth telling, and does anyone even care anymore? 50-year-old woman still alive after surviving a violent attack 30 years ago is not a news story. Back then, it was a big deal. Back then, it was fresh. And back then, the bad guy's name and the magnitude of his perverted, psychotic, violent crime spree sparked emotion, and everyone wanted to know who this monster was and how did someone possibly survive all the pain that he inflicted. Well, there were 4 of us in his Vancouver crime spree that did just that. We survived. And to the best of my knowledge, we still are, in different ways. It needs to be said that being a survivor is a pretty lonely place, and I also think that most of us know that, because too many of us are survivors. It makes me think of the word naivety. To be naive, in the true definition of the word, it means that you are deficient in worldly wisdom or informed judgment. Is it possible to possess worldly wisdom at the age of 21? That's how old I was when this happened in 1992. How about age 51? Would it help us to survive better then if we knew what we know now? And do men naturally possess more worldly wisdom or informed judgment than women? Do certain jobs attract those who have these kinds of gifts, like law enforcement, policing? Clearly, I have a lot of questions. And on the law enforcement thought, I have to agree. Because really, when you're employed in that role, when you choose to be in that role, as a police officer, informed judgment is critical in solving the crimes, the mysteries, and finding the bad guy. To solve the crime, I would assume in the policing world, there's no room for naivety. But what if you are a police officer and your case just doesn't add up? What do you do? Well, this is what happened in my world. I went missing without a trace. It became evident to me, as I continued to be a missing person, that hopes and prayers were becoming my only hope of survival. And this is where it all started. If I could find a positive beam of light in all of this surviving crime crap, it would be my friendship with now retired former homicide detective Stu. Stu and his partner were the first to investigate me as a missing person, and he was there for the whole thing. I interviewed Stu in 2022, and even though I've spent many days celebrating with him and his family, birthdays, weddings, Christmas, I really don't think I've ever talked one-on-one with him about this incident in detail before. So, I guess 30 years is a good time to start.
Okay, my name, as you said, is Stu Gillette. I'm now 72 years old, so I may not be able to remember everything quite as lucidly as I had hoped. I was with my partner, Don Jarvis, we were both detectives in the homicide and robbery section. We responded to a call of a missing person, suspicious circumstances, possible robbery. I can't remember exactly how it was classified, but we responded as a result of uniformed police officers who worked in that area having responded. I believe it was because of suspicious circumstances. The front door to a shop was open. That sort of sticks in my mind, but I may be wrong on that. But we found when we arrived, mid-morning I guess it was, and it was just after the July 1st holiday. It was a bridal photography shop. There was supposed to be staff on the premises, but that staff member, i.e. yourself, was MIA. Nobody knew where you were. So that initiated the missing person component of this investigation, and it very, very quickly became a real whodunit. Like, this doesn't really happen a lot. This scenario doesn't really play out like that a lot, in my experience at that time. People don't just disappear. A lot of missing persons they're not missing to them. They know exactly where they are, and they have their reasons for doing what they're doing. But this had the earmarks of something else. It wasn't right. It felt wrong. And so consequently we started with, all right, how do we find out what happened? So we had other police officers go in and knock on doors and interview people as to, if they saw anything. The shop was on Hastings Street in East Vancouver, right near the border of Vancouver and Burnaby. There is a major bus loop just down the street on Hastings westbound. It's a busy area. There's a lot of people, foot traffic and vehicular traffic at any given time of day, and most evenings. There's a lot of traffic there, and very, very heavily populated. So we were at a loss, really, because we tried to find everything that we could possibly think of to enlighten us as to what was going on here in this shop. And it just did not appear to be the way that a person leaving for the day would leave a shop, right? There was a pair of shoes there. There were other things. Like there's a little office space off the back, and it didn't appear as though it really had been turned over or anything, but there were things that were out of order. So it could have been a whole bunch of different things. So the possibilities were, only bounded by our imaginations, right? So what we were facing when we walked in the door was a mystery. What police generically refer to as a whodunit. And truly there are not a whole lot of whodunits in policing. There's always generally something that tends to help point an investigation in a particular direction, and you follow from there. Sometimes that can lead you in completely the wrong direction, but in this case it was like, my goodness, what's happened to this person? So then, we're faced with the situation of, okay, so who knows this person that's not where she's supposed to be? Parents, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever. Then it's incumbent upon us to try and determine, the last known movements and then work from there. And we were coming up zeros.
So, that's a great question. What did happen to me? Well, obviously I'm still here, so I lived. However, there were 9 days that I wasn't locatable, gone, without a trace to everyone except me and the bad guy. When I talk to Stu now, I assume he knows what happened. that he still remembers now because, well, that was his job. But that's my assumption. My case was one of many for him in a 27-ish year policing career. And the police way of looking at what happened is very different. Their view is more fact-based and less about the story. They remember facts and the bad guy. Or maybe that's just Stu. He told me recently that he had one long conversation with this bad guy. And that story, that impression, stuck hard. And I'd have to agree, in those 9 days, I had many long conversations with this bad guy, and those stories also stuck pretty hard. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and, really, it's such a long and kind of complicated story. It's kind of easy for me to jump around. So, let's start at the beginning. Let's go back to 1992. Let's go back to 21-year-old me. Maybe we can learn something about the benefits of being young, ambitious, unaware, and naive. I mean, really, who trusts a filthy stranger with a gun in your face who tells you if you just obey him on one simple instruction, he'll let you go home? And if I knew then what I know now about what actually was going to happen, would I have survived? So let's find out. It's story time. Have a listen. Maybe something will make sense. "1992 was supposed to be my golden year. If you've never heard of it, that's the year you turn the age of your birthday. The golden year is supposed to be the year that you shine, your best year. So for me, I was born on the 21st of April, and in 1992, I turned 21. I had just moved to Vancouver, and my favorite band was the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Blood, Sugar, Sex, Magic. The album was pure magic. The cassette was on constant repeat in my blue 81 Cutlass. I could not get enough. My favorite shoes were slouchy black high heel boots with pointy toes, rocker boots. And my goal in life was to be a photojournalist. But for now, I worked at Suitors, a photo studio with a retail film development lab in the basement. Digital cameras did not exist back then. You bought your film, took your pictures, wound them into a sealed canister thing, and dropped it off at a place like Suitors for processing. And most of the time, you had to wait at least a day to get your pictures back, and you had to go somewhere to pick them up. And this is where I worked, standing behind a glass counter, looking friendly amongst a clutter of framed smiling faces and bright yellow for sale tags. The last day I ever worked there, I did what I always did. I passed the time organizing the printed photos that were ready for pickup. I wiped down the counters that I had already wiped the day before. I tidied the clutter again, and I stood and stared at the window in front of me of the busy street at cars and pedestrians as they hurried by, and I was never busy. I felt like I was going nowhere. I craved interaction and customers to relieve the boredom, to make me feel human, to take my mind off the sadness of missing home and be my real self. But I wasn't there to be my real self. I was there to sell. According to my manager, it was important that these things for sale moved out that door. It was important that I made sure that customers bought more than they came in for. And that rarely happened. I mean, they didn't cover retail sales in journalism school. When someone came in, a small bell above the door would chime, and in they walked, and there I stood. Straight back, pasted smile, friendly greeting. Good morning, good day, hello, whatever. On July the 3rd, at around 11 a.m., a man walked in surrounded by the worst cloud of stench that I have ever smelled. I smelled him before I could even register his physical presence. He stood in front of me and he shuffled. He was taller than me. His build was bony. His clothing, particularly his jeans, hung like they were dripping with dirt. He was so dirty. He smiled at me. I forced myself to remember my training. "Hello," I said, doing my very best to smile. He said, "I'm interested in getting some family photos done." He spoke with some level of formal articulation, which surprised me. He said, "Of my mother, especially. Do you do that kind of thing?" He stared and waited for a reply. He seemed nervous. His eyes flicked around the room, and again he shifted his body, and he watched me. I took a step towards the brochure holder. I answered, "We take family portraits." I handed him the brochure. Being close to him, the smell was painful. My eyes burned. He stepped backwards. I did too. And for the next minute or two, which felt like 100 hours, we both did the customer sales thing where I pointed to the many family portrait examples hanging on the walls. And then he was gone, physically. I saw him turn right towards the bus loop up Hastings. The stench, however, remained. I started gagging, and the only thing I could think was that it was like being forced to stand downwind from a pile of dead, rotten bodies. My manager kept an aerosol can of potpourri-scented spray on the shelf beside the radio, and I hated it, and I'd never used it by choice until now. It really didn't help. Soon enough, though, it was lunchtime, and I was hungry, so I guess I'd moved on. I had a homemade sandwich to eat, but could only eat it in the back, windowless photo studio and never in the front. Customers could never see you eat. So I tucked myself away on a stool, still able to hear the bell and sort of see the door. I heard the chime, and I got up quickly, chewing and swallowing, and it was my dad. His car was parked out front. He was heading home to Calgary and just stopped quickly to pay me back the $20 from dinner last night. I gave him the 2-minute tour. His reaction was, not unexpectedly, indifferent. And then he was gone. After that, no one came in for hours. And at the time in my life, I was alone and sad. A lot. I had just moved here 2 months ago, and I missed my old boyfriend. I missed my old life in Calgary. I remember wondering, what was I going to do that night? What could distract me, make me happy? And the door chimes. And there he was again, the man with the smell. He said, "Hi again. Is Debbie in?" Debbie was my manager. He held her card in between his thumb and index finger on his right hand. It looked so bent and dog-eared and worn. I had not given the card to him. "No, she's on location today," I said. "Can I help you with something?" He said, "Yes, I hope so. I want to find out more about getting some family pictures done. It's mostly for my mom. She's getting older and she doesn't get out much. Would Debbie be able to come to her house?" I said, "Yes, we'd be happy to help." "How much room would Debbie need to set up? Would she travel to Burnaby? Would she charge a travel fee? What was Debbie's experience with large groups, and would she be able to come outside of business hours?" He seemed to have a lot of questions. I struggled to breathe. I continued to sell. "We could probably fit your whole family in the studio for a portrait session," I suggested. With that, his eyes snapped to attention. His mouth went serious. "Where's the studio?" he asked. "Here," I pointed towards the studio. I opened the door as wide as it would go, and he followed me in. The studio, this room, was bigger, and the ceiling was higher. There were no windows and no back door. He pulled a little notepad out of his back pocket, then fished around for a pen in his front pocket and jotted something down. "This is interesting," he said, looking around, and then he laughed again. Again I gagged, and again I sprayed. I was relieved. But this time I was also confused. At the time, I actually thought that he seemed nice and smart. And yes, he stunk, but he cared about his family, especially his mom. He must be a laborer, I thought. Maybe he worked in some sort of factory. Maybe with his job, he always wears the same clothes and nobody there cares that he smells. The next few hours at Suitors dragged, and I remained alone. As it got closer to 5, I cashed out a little early. It was super easy. I pushed a couple buttons on the cash register, a little piece of paper with a bunch of zeros beside the sales categories popped out, and just the $200 float to account for. I put the cash in a little yellow envelope and stuffed it behind the curtain in the studio. This was our version of a safe. I went back to the front and looked up at the clock hanging on the wall behind me. It was 4:56. My back was to the door and the bell chimed. "I'm back," he chirped with enthusiasm. "I've been thinking about that studio option," he added. "I'd really like to see it again." I turned back towards the studio and he followed. He was close. I held my breath. We walked 3, possibly 4 steps into the back room until we were out of sight of the front door, and something cold and hard pressed strongly against my cheek. "I want the money," he said. He pushed a black 9mm into my face. All that came out of my mouth was a sound. A delicate scold of a sound. But in my head I screamed, "What the fuck?" And so it began, a journey into the unknown and a solo 9-day battle I was not prepared for. Up until that point in my life, I'd never seen a gun. I mean, I'd seen one hanging on a wall in a house on display for some reason, but nothing like a handgun. I mean, who carries a handgun in Canada anyway? Bad guys, that's who. And apparently I had just been introduced to one of them. There was no way out. That was over 30 years ago, and today, that moment, that experience comes up as vividly as if I'm experiencing it now. I hear him, I sense him, I smell him, and I feel a yearning to protect that young girl. Me. Oddly, I also feel pride in seeing how she handled it in that moment. I wouldn't ask her to do anything differently. She did the best she could with what she knew. She'd not received any schooling on how to prevent an armed robbery. She was not versed in how to recognize that you were being stalked. She was a kid working a minimum wage job and dreaming of bigger things. She'd never met anyone like this creep before. So, what came next? Well, it's clear to me now that she/I came close to losing my life to him. Back then, in that moment, I didn't see that. I kind of think it was like time just stopped because real life, as I knew it, had stopped. It was beyond awful, though, like dying in slow motion. When I look back, I'd never want to go there again. So to answer my question, would I have survived then if I knew what I know now? And the answer would be no. Being naive saved me. Being blind to the horrific possibilities that lay ahead while still being determined to achieve what I set out to do in life made the next day, the next moment possible. I feel that I lived pretty much the next 20 plus years with this mindset. Becoming a mother, though, that's where it all changed. That's where the walls that naivety built came crumbling down. That is where the true impact of trauma showed its ugly head. I was so not prepared. Again, there's no room for naivety in motherhood. It's your job to protect your little being from the horrific possibilities that lay ahead. So anyway, again, I'm getting ahead of myself. In the next few episodes, the mothering/parenting theme will play a part in the storytelling. Recently, I actually sat down with my mom and my dad separately to gain a little insight into what they experienced when I disappeared. And until now, we'd never done this. I mean, why would we? We just had to get back to the surviving life stuff, right? It definitely was a powerful conversation for me, especially. And I look forward to sharing that with you and more.